free to ask anything that might come to mind.
I would like to ask
Yes.
MC, what is the schedule for the rest of the day?
The schedule
According to this.
It's an excellent question, and the answer is that we will continue our discussion until 2:30 or 14:30. In other words, we have 40 minutes of this small group, and then we will daven mincha at that time, Nusach Ashkenaz, and after that,
I know the cousin is now. It's debatable.
Nusach Ashkenaz, debatable. And at 2:45,
They have to make some guidelines in order to get them.
very relevant comment, very relevant. From 2:45 until 4 p.m., we will adhere to the schedule. We will be having our moot court, which promises to be really very interesting. We will be having Judge Handel from the Supreme Court and Rav Michael Abraham Ram from the Jesselson Institute. So we are going to, the only part of the deviation is currently is the small group discussion which we're having here. So so for the next 40 minutes then we have time. Any questions at all? Please feel free to just speak up loudly. Anybody? Dr. Sperber, Rabbi Sperber, Dr. Sperber.
Open the discussion.
Yes, please do.
We heard that there were 4 or 5 or perhaps 6 principles of bioethics. And one was, I don't know if it was the first one.
Autonomy,
no,
beneficence, non-beneficence, yes.
But I think the real question is, how do we know what is beneficent?
How do we know what is beneficence?
Yeah. Now, for example, we probably thought a while ago, and perhaps it was also true, that antibiotics were the best things to come into the world. And now we know that the effects might be quite serious. And many apparent elements which we would call progress, which were benefiting humanity, are having absolutely disastrous ecological effects. So how do we know what is beneficent? For example, when we're talking about medical ethics, is the prolongation of human life for the individuals, is that necessarily a good thing? Will the world in 20 years' time be able to support double our population? We have, what, 7 billion? Will it, prolongation of life is an additional element that's going to increase the numbers, plus population developments? And are we necessarily, when we lengthen life, do we also lengthen the quality of life? How do we measure these various things? And that also links up with what Professor Fishbach said, that we shouldn't necessarily do everything we can, but everything we should. But what is the should? What are the principles of should? So it's very nice to have these sort of bullet points, but how do we understand them in total?
Well, shall I repeat Dr. Sperber's question? Yeah. The question is, I mentioned this morning that there are these actually 4 principles. There should be the 5th, the sanctity of life. We'll say the 4. One of them is beneficence, doing good. We should always do good for our patients, do good for humanity. And the question is, how is that determined? Sometimes what we think is good turns out to have very deleterious long-term side effects. The example that was given was in antibiotics, for example. Clearly, when they were invented, they were seen as an unmitigated good. Penicillin invented curing heretofore uniformly fatal infections. However, over time and decades, we see that there has been an overuse of antibiotics with the emergence of more deadly and resistant strains of bacteria. The use of antibiotics, many people would feel in the agricultural industry or in the cattle industry, may in fact be deleterious to those of us who ingest meat and so forth. That's one example. The next example given by Dr. Sperber was, we talk about the prolongation of life as being beneficent. However, there are other countervailing arguments and issues such as the quality of life and human suffering and the effect of the unmitigated prolongation of life on society in terms of the utilization of resources. So it's all well and good to have a lovely catch-all phrase like beneficence, but how do we really know when we are doing good, how much good do we have to do for that argument to really carry? If I may, this is finally somebody's asked a question I can answer. This is fantastic. This is what I deal with all the time, really. And at the bedside, we deal with this. I'm not talking about global issues. I think the issue of global issues, you know, we don't generally invoke those terms for Congress or the Knesset. I don't think they say, well, let's consider this bill now as this beneficent, non-maleficent, and so forth. Nevertheless, societal issues are passed all the time, and I think obviously in the minds of legislators, other than get reelected, they must have some feeling or chush of what is good for the country and society and humanity. At least we hope so. So I'll confine my response really to me at the bedside. We always have, what makes medical ethics interesting is the fact that we do have these dilemmas, and if it were just a checklist and this was a clear-cut issue, then it would be boring. But what makes it, as the professor said this morning, what makes a Jew Jewish is arguments, right? So what makes medical ethics interesting are the subtleties, the nuances, the grays. I'll give you an example then. Let's say we have a patient who has a lack of mental capacity because of a psychiatric illness. And this patient would clearly benefit from, let's say, an amputation of his or her leg because they have gangrene and they have diabetes. And the patient is nevertheless loudly protesting that they don't want this for whatever reason. The beneficent aspect of the issue, of course, is we should save the life or prolong the life by carrying out the amputation. On the other hand, violating a patient's wishes, no matter how irrational, can have severe and deleterious and long-lasting consequences to that patient. The patient may feel mutilated, the patient may feel violated. Or I'll give you an example. We had a patient who was a homeless man, clearly had psychiatric illness, who was blind because of cataracts. And this man came in the hospital, was brought there by police, and once his immediate medical problem was taken care of, he lay in bed and simply said, I can't see, I can't see. And we said, Norman, because that was the name he gave, which wasn't his real name subsequently. We said, Norman, we can give your sight back again. We can take out your cataracts. It's very simple. No, 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 I'm afraid, no, no. And this went on day after day. Beneficence would say clearly, we should do this against his wishes. On the other hand, people have autonomy, there's the other value. Should we violate this man? And in his case, we would have to take him to the operating room, put him under anesthesia because he was not going to cooperate in order to restore his sight. And there's always a possibility of causing problems, etc., in the course of anesthesia, etc. So should we be beneficent to the, here is a question of a conflict. I'll just get to the bottom of the story, although it's a fascinating tale of how this subsequently played out. Eventually, we were actually able to locate his sister by fingerprinting him. The police fingerprinted him. They came up with his identity. He had been run into some minor infractions of the law. We were able to contact his sister, who lived in Rochester or Boston, I believe. She was delighted that we found him, and she was his legal guardian, and she gave permission to do the operation. We restored his sight, and he was delighted. But when we said, can we also operate on your other eye? No. So, but he was thrilled to be able to see. So these, I think that the beneficence and so forth, and the issue that you raised, which we deal with all the time, of the prolongation of life, and here's where you get into halachic issues as well. When does prolonging life evolve into prolonging the dying process? When does prolonging life turn into harming a patient by causing pain and suffering? And so I think that these four categories are useful as scaffolds to hang your argument on. They do not give us proscriptive advice about how to act in each and every instance. The other reason they're useful, I'll tell you why, is because every specialty has to have its own jargon, otherwise you're not legitimate. So we can come to, well, this case is really beneficence versus non-maleficence. And so everybody else would say, common sense would say you want to help the patient versus not, but the ability to use jargon elevates you a little bit. But the truth is that they do help sometimes, I think, in organizing people's thoughts, etc. But you're absolutely right. The issue of beneficence, untrammeled technology, which we can think of as a beneficent thing, has significant aspects economically. We have now left, in Colombia, you can be in the ICU in Colombia, your heart function can be taken over by a machine, your lung function can be taken over by a machine, your kidney function can be taken over by a machine, your breathing function can be taken over by a machine, and your gastrointestinal function can be taken over. So you can have failure of 4 organs or 5 organs basically and be kept alive at great and incredible cost. So is that beneficence? And at what point do you, as I say, at what point do you go from beneficence to actually causing harm? I have no answer. Each case you have to look at, you have to apply clinical judgment and wisdom and take into account the patient's feelings and the family's feelings and the religious issues, et cetera, et cetera. So that's a very long-winded answer to your question. Do you have any comments or questions on that?
Just add that, because there's always the economic question.
The-
In the ICQ,
The economic issue is a huge, undealt with issue.
how many people could be helped if this gentleman was not
Look.
kept on machines for X number of
The economic issue is a huge issue, and we have not one, zero ability to deal with it. And I'll tell you what I'm talking about. At Columbia, which is probably true of most major hospitals in America, the issue of medical futility arises, and I won't get into a whole talk on that. But does a family have a right? I'm sorry?
Define futility.
Define it? People have been trying to, I'll tell you how I define medical futility. I define medical futility as a situation in which a patient has zero chance to leave the hospital alive. Every doctor, every nurse, there is no question but that this patient will die, this hospitalization, has no quality of life, and yet we can prolong that patient's life by weeks or months. And I've seen this happen time and time again. You say, well, how do you know? You can't be always right. There are times when we know. Believe me, trust me, we know. And so every effort that I'll give you, here's an example. We had a man who had a heart transplant at Columbia, okay? Labor intensive, monetary intensive. The man was on a left ventricular assist device for 6 months as a bridge to transplant. What is that? His heart was so bad he couldn't live without a mechanical assisted pump, basically a left ventricular assist device. So he was at home on a mechanical device pumping. A heart became available. He was brought to the hospital. The heart was transplanted in him of a 16-year-old boy, should have been fine. The boy had no heart disease. For whatever reason, the heart did not work after implantation. It did not contract for whatever technical reason. Everything had gone hunky-dory and smoothly. The surgeon at that time is faced then with, do I let this man die, or do I put in another left ventricular assist device to keep him alive as a bridge to another transplant? And surgeons are very loath, understandably, they're human beings, they are loath to let somebody die on the operating table when they have the technical ability to keep the patient alive. So they put in another left ventricular assist device. The patient was taken back to the intensive care unit with the implanted heart in his body not working, now being kept alive with the ventricular assist device. He developed horrific complications of bleeding, had to go back to the operating room, many units of blood used. He developed clots in the left ventricular assist device, embolized to his brain, had horrific strokes, leaving him neurologically devastated, but not brain dead. He went into kidney failure, and he received CVVH, continuous veno-venous dialysis, and so forth. So his kidneys are failed, he has no heart function, and now he's got massive neurologic damage. He developed recurrent horrific infections requiring the use of potent antibiotics, fungal infections requiring antibiotics, and everybody said he's certainly not a candidate for another heart transplant, not with this neurological devastation. We will not, quote unquote, waste a heart on somebody who won't live, who has no quality of life. His wife, by the way, was extremely angry at all this and felt that we had botched the job. So here is a man who had zero chance of leaving the hospital alive. Will you agree with me? This man could not leave the hospital alive. He was being kept alive on ultra-sophisticated, ultra-expensive technology, and the wife refused to let us to even withhold, forget about withdrawing, but even withhold treatment. She would not permit us to not get blood tests, not give him antibiotics, et cetera, et cetera. So, okay, he's costing, his bill, by the way, came to $1.3 million. That's his hospital bill alone. He died after 4.5 months in the hospital. He was kept alive this way. The reason he died is he eventually developed brain death. So his circulation was still going. The machine never fails. His kidney function was still going, the CVVH. His brain, finally he developed brain death, and at that point, against the wishes of the wife, the doctor stopped the machine. What should we have done in that situation? $1.3 million, I would say wasted, because the man had no quality of life. This was an angry woman who said we botched it, was adamant that we continue everything. That's a case of medical futility. Now, what do you do in that circumstance? Do you just say, I'm sorry, Mrs. So-and-so, your husband has no chance of living, and we are going to stop the ventilator, or stop, the rabbi?
Just one sentence. Of course, what is still alive, and we know the neurable trials, and the other edge is frightening even more. It's
I'm sorry.
The other side of it all, of the rainbow, that there are life not worth living.
Yeah.
Just saying there is life not worth living of an Untermensch is not worth living in general. So the other edge of the equation is also frightening.
So what do you think we did right?
I don't think you could do otherwise.
Okay, look, we did it, so I'm not criticizing you. We obviously did it. In general, yeah. Why didn't we? First of all, I would say that in general, in the 15 to 20 years that I have been doing this job at Columbia, I really can't think of one instance, a single instance, when the hospital has unilaterally gone against the wishes of a family, even in a desperate situation like this, and withdrawn. I mean, if they had insisted on, major surgery or some huge thing, that's a different story. But to take a patient off a life-sustaining device and let them die right then, we've never done it. Why haven't we done it? Number one, we are afraid of going to court. She could have sued us, but it wouldn't have gone anyplace. But nobody wants problems. The hospital is allergic to
That's a frightening thought, but that's the number one.
I don't say it's number one, but it's up there. Number two, if this lady had gone to the New York Post and said the doctors at Columbia are butchers, not only did they botch my husband's operation, but then they killed him by not even keeping him alive. New York Post runs a story, doctors at Columbia play God. I mean, these are not crazy things.
This goes beyond ethics, this goes to public management.
Absolutely.
Public perception.
Yes. I do think it goes beyond ethics. I mean, the utilization issue is there. It's not just utilization. There's a burnout of doctors and nurses. There are doctors who feel that they are doing something unethical. There are some doctors who would say, what I am doing by sticking this man and taking his blood, et cetera, this is not medicine, this is wrong. And so there are other issues. I can tell you that there's probably only one state in the United States that has a law enacted by a legislature. Texas has a futility law which permits doctors to unilaterally withhold or withdraw life support against wishes of a family, but there is a long and arduous process, and the law has never been tested in court, even though families who have been the recipients of this law, so to speak, have threatened to go to court. Usually the patients actually die before they've had that done. In general society, in America, I don't know how it is in Israel, but in America, society is loath to give doctors life and death power over the wishes of the family. They are loath. New York State in particular was loath to do that. Society says, I would rather overtreat people against the wishes of the physicians than undertreat people adhering to physicians' wishes. Society says we are afraid that doctors will abuse the power that we might give them by giving them the legal safe harbor of unilaterally withholding or withdrawing treatment.
What happened to the 5 people who were standing in the corridor that needed this?
There weren't any. Now here I will tell you,
I'm saying the-
Dr. Sperber, let me tell you this, and this I always tell my students and the house staff and so forth. It's very hard to show that the $1.3 million expended on this man caused suffering or want of resources of a particular patient. You can't show that because the money is fungible. And the other thing is that if we had done this and unilaterally withheld, it becomes arbitrary to a certain extent because there are certain hospitals that would and certain, you need a societal approach to the problem. You need society. This is not a thing that's done on a case by doctors, in my opinion, because it is this is heavy duty stuff. The other thing is to do this against people screaming and yelling at the bedside. If they had said to me, Ken Prager, you're the attending here, we want you to extubate this man. And the woman is standing over there, Dr. Prager, and screaming, I wouldn't do it. I don't need this hanging over my head that I did this. I might feel right about it. Should I have security take her out of the room then and do this? You see, these are difficult issues.
I was asking you if somebody comes in from an ambulance with a stretcher. And he needs, yeah, I know the triage system.
When you have a single bed and 2 sick people coming in, I think even there halachically, you are permitted to give it to the person that you have a greater chance of helping, not to the person who yells more. That's a different story. But you know what? We live in a rich country in America. We have a large amount. This won't continue indefinitely, by the way, and I'll comment on that. But we rarely, if ever, the whole issue after Katrina occurred, the hurricane in Louisiana, and there was an article written by a young woman whom I know well. She just won the Pulitzer Prize for it. She wrote about doctors who euthanized patients in the hospital there. They were dying, etc. And she became very interested, the reporter, in triage and rationing. And when we had the H1N1 epidemic, we had a meeting in New York City of the ethics chairs and the ICU heads of all the major hospitals. What would we do in a massive epidemic if we had a limited number of respirators and we had an unlimited number of people who required it? And a policy was enunciated, actually, by the New York State Task Force on Life and the Law, which gave parameters for triage and so forth. However, in that policy, it was stated that if a patient were intubated and on a ventilator, and they did not reach a certain score, shall we say, of survivability, that they would be extubated. They would, even against the wishes of the family. Now, would that work? That's tough stuff. I don't know. I think it's unrealistic to think that on a major scale that you would be able to do that, or you would find the health providers who would be willing to do that. Forget about legal liability. Just emotionally, it would be extraordinarily difficult. So, now I'll tell you the perfect storm. The perfect storm that's brewing in America is as follows. You have the baby boom generation, people born after 1946 for the next, 10 years or so, and they are becoming in their 60s, 70s, 80s. You're going to have a huge population becoming old in the United States. And in the next 10, 20 years, you're going to have continued evolution of medical technology. It goes on. It continues at an exponential rate. It's unbelievable. We have these ECMO machines, these artificial lungs. 2 years ago, they didn't exist. Now they're all over the ICU. And they are on a collision course. You have technology evolving at a rapid rate, drugs, chemotherapeutic agents, wonderful things, and you have an aging population. It will become impossible financially to sustain the current level of medical treatment unless there is a deus ex machina that comes down with a printing machine that will print money for us. I don't know how this is going to happen. And I don't know the answer to that. I think the Obama plan does nothing really to deal with expenses. It talks about increasing coverage. It's got some good things in it. So the question that you ask and the whole issue of resources is going to come to a head. But the way democracies work, in my opinion, they don't work proactively. They wait for crisis because it's politically unpopular to do things that are even good ahead of time. You'll get voted out of office. So when there will be a crisis, and there will be a crisis, no question about it, the legislature of the United States will have to come up in its infinite wisdom with some way of dealing with this. And I don't know it will be a wise decision, but that's when the you-know-what will hit the fan. And there are going to be some very bitter and difficult debates at that time, I can tell you.
You run into the opposite situation, that the patient is suffering so much he wants to terminate, or his wife or his relatives, maybe they're interested in the inheritance. They want to terminate, and the doctor doesn't.
Good question. The answer to the question, whenever a patient wishes to be removed from life support, which is not frequent but happens on a regular basis, the ethics committee is called. Usually psychiatry is called to make sure the patient has capacity and understand. We will see the patient as well. And I would say usually, but not always, the patient is taken off life support. That's the autonomy part. When it's clinically appropriate, if a patient is suffering, they're on a ventilator, and in 3 days more on a ventilator, we think they'll do fine. We're not going to let somebody die because they're sick and tired of being on a ventilator in 3 more days. They need to really have a good shot at life. But if the patient's got terminal cancer, or an elderly patient just went through a debilitating operation, and you're looking at months of rehabilitation, possibly getting them better, tracheostomy, feeding tube, we feel patients have a right to say, I've had it enough. And we will let that patient die. Now, the issue of, there are some times where a patient clearly has no capacity. Again, we have to put it in the context of the clinical reality. The issue of the family, you know, the Arusha thing, the inheritance thing, obviously this is always something you can think about. We like to look at the clinical realities. If a family is making a reasonable request to withhold or remove life support, we will, if it's a no-brainer, if I may use the pun, and usually it's a neurologically devastating situation, we do that. We do that. If it is a more nuanced type of situation where the patient has a chance at living, but there might be some horrific disability, et cetera, what usually gains the day is if they can represent to us what the patient's wishes were and how that might apply here, and we think that that's reasonable, we will listen to the family. It happens infrequently that we will do this and the doctors think it's inappropriate. I'll tell you one very interesting example, however, of how mistakes can be made. We call this, by the way, substituted judgment when the family says, my brother would have wanted this if he could say this. I was once called about a case in New Jersey. It was not at Columbia. A man developed an infected finger, a laborer, and he ended up septic, hypotensive, and he developed gangrene of his arms and legs. He was in his 50s or so. And the brother and the girlfriend, he was on a respirator and a dialysis machine. And the two relatives, the closest relatives, said to the doctors at this hospital, take him off the ventilator, let him die, because you're saying he needs to have amputation of all 4 extremities. He would not want to live this way. I mean, it's not as if he spoke about it. Nobody would ever think of such a thing, but we know him, and he was a laborer, et cetera, et cetera. And I got a call from one of the members of the ethics committee who happened to be a former student of mine, and he wanted to know my thoughts on it. And I felt very uneasy about this, especially in the fact that man still had his mind. And I had just read an article in the New England Journal of Medicine that week about the mutilating operations done on veterans who came back from Iraq, American soldiers, and some of the horrific operations that they had to sustain. And I said to myself, these are even far worse than this. And I mean, I don't know a person's reaction to it, but how do you know? You don't know how a person's going to react to this. And if in doubt, you vote for life. That's my feeling. So I said, I don't think I would go along with this. I felt very uneasy, but that was his thing. Anyway, they went along with it. They had a meeting of the ethics committee. They took the person off the respirator. He didn't die. They stopped his dialysis. His kidneys came back. He then regained consciousness, and his brother said to him, Joe, in order for you to live, the doctors have to amputate your arms and legs. What should we do? And he said, do what it takes. And he then lapsed back into respiratory distress. They intubated him. The bottom line is he underwent amputation of all 4 extremities, below the knee and mid forearms. And when he was about to leave the hospital for the rehabilitation unit, my friend who had called me went in to visit him and say goodbye, and the man said, gee, thanks, Doc, for saving my life. And in the email to me, my friend said, little did he know what had transpired prior to this. So, you know, again, I think when in doubt, I can't give you an ironclad rule that we always do this, always do that. And that's why it's important to have more than one person and to look at the clinical circumstances. These are life and death decisions that we do not make easily. Yes, sir.
Just wondering, would you say that, not regarding the terminal patient, but for the general mass of the population, wouldn't you say that the prolongation of life would usually go along with an improvement in the quality of life, increasing the period of productivity, and perhaps also a decrease in birth rates, mitigating the population problem? Wouldn't you say that?
You know, I didn't get, could you come up, I'm not very good at hearing, so if you could come up a little closer, because it's an important question. I got some of it. Yeah, if you don't mind, thank you. And then I'll repeat it. Or you want to speak in here, or is that too much? Okay.
Not in terms of terminal patients,
Yes.
but if we regard to the general population as a mass, wouldn't you say that the prolongation of life usually goes along with an increase in the quality of life, increase in the period of productivity, also
The spirit of
increase in the period of their productivity? I mean,
productivity?
Now I mean we retired at age 67.
Yeah.
With the prolongation of life. Before that, we retired at 50 or probably died at age 40 out
Yeah.
of infection disease.
Well, yeah, I mean, look, I mean,
And also the decrease in birth rate, which obviates the population.
it would decrease birth rate, you're saying,
Yes, yes.
by
yes.
prolonging life?
Prolongation of life usually correlates with a decrease in birth rate.
Really? I didn't know that. Well, I mean, I don't think I could use that as a reason for, look, you know, when you say prolongation of life, first of all, it's not for me, the doctor. My job as a doctor is to talk to the patient and to tell them, here's the facts and here are the issues. If not the patient, then the family. And let them make that decision. I don't want to be in a situation where we say, you know, 80 years old, it's enough already, and I don't know that it's really appropriate to do X, Y, and Z. It's really, I think the quality of life, most people, I don't say all, most people don't want to just live and lie in bed, totally helpless, certainly if they're in pain. I'm at an elderly age, I'm not talking about younger people now, I think there's a big difference. Most people would elect not to do that, I think, but that's not a decision for me to make. What I really object to, and people are living longer, what I object to are what I see going on in the ICUs, this type of case. That was an extreme example, but there are many examples where patients are kept alive for days or weeks or months in intensive care with no chance of getting better, or patients who have massive operations at old age who are not told the potential consequences of it because physicians want to do the surgery, etc. I think, so that's what I'm against. Whether, I don't think we'll ever get to a point where we will say in the US, I don't think so, where we will say in the US, after 80, we are not going to do X, Y, and Z. If X, Y, and Z can prolong a life with good quality. I think if we have data to show that doing X, Y, or Z after 80 has very little chance of helping, or has a remote chance, then we have the right as a society to say, no, we won't do that because it only helps 1 or 2% of the population. Putting in implantable defibrillators in older people with heart failure is a real question as to whether that's a wise thing to do. But again, these are, as I say, really societal questions. I don't think it should be left up to individual doctors should be honest and open and talk and communicate with people. Yes?
I ask a question? Your descriptions are very, very